questions? Perhaps I can kick it off. One of the statements that I made was that our organizations need to change. Now, yours have moved a long way. What were the difficulties to overcome internally?
Well, I would love to tell you the fantasy that there were no difficulties, that everyone accepted change happily and willingly. The fact of the matter is that anytime the leadership of an academic institution proposes the sort of fundamental change that we are discussing here, you become the object of vilification and well, accused of bringing civilization to an end single-handedly. As much as I would love to be able to have that degree of power, all I wanted to do was reorganize the institution around these principles. Once we were past, it took about 8 months, once we were past the initial resistance to change of any sort, people began to see the advantage of these reorganizations, and then did the ultimate praise, claimed that they were responsible for these changes. And that was a moment of great satisfaction. But you're right, getting staff to change and to change focus of the results of their work is a real challenge.
Thank you. More questions?
Yeah.
Well, I would like to thank you both representatives from United States for the nice presentation. And actually, I have a question. Recently, in a National Academy of Science annual meeting, a brilliant economist from Harvard named Joy Chetty, he presented a very nice paper where he shows that the percentage of Americans, young people, that are getting degree of education that goes beyond the parents is going down. And then he makes an association of this with the basic instruction in science. Even though the efforts to show science to young people is going on, it's like a show. They don't really get on their soul, and then they don't get impassioned with this, and therefore they are not enthusiastic enough to go on with their formation, whatever is the field they choose. And then as a consequence, we have all this big mess, because the people that do not appreciate and do not understand the surrounding, they do not contribute. And I thought it was very astonishing, the data. And he did this by analyzing the big data that a lot of people are analyzing to see what's the commercial interest of people, but it seems that some economists, smart, are looking to the big data to really extract information that should depress, like policy makers' action. I would like to know your comments, being from the United States, what you think about those statements from this brilliant economist from Harvard.
Well, first of all, I appreciate your validation of my notion that professors have less trust than institutions, because I've never heard of any economist from Harvard being quoted who didn't have the description "brilliant economist from Harvard" preceding their name. Look, we should never forget, none of us should forget, in this effort to engage the public, that 50%, fully 50% of every public that we address is of below average intelligence. Don't forget that. We have a tendency to speak to one another. I am constantly reminding my colleagues that we have to, in addition to impressing our own peers, we have to engage that poorly educated, not particularly gifted public, because they vote as well. I know I have seen the studies as well. I'm married to a science educator. It is a very dismal time right now for science education in the United States. And the temptation to abandon those people who are turning their backs on our work is very strong. But we can't afford to. We can't give up. We have to create, as Lori has demonstrated, new and engaging ways to bring them into these scientific questions, in spite of themselves.
But my question is are we using the correct model, or we should reanalyze a little bit what we're doing to really educate the basic education, science and everything?
That's, I think, exactly the question. Are we using the right model? And the only way that we can get a reliable answer for that is by listening carefully to the people that we're trying to talk to. And when they don't respond, when they find the term biodiversity uninspiring, boring, uninteresting, then we have to find other ways. As Bruno said, we have a kilo of bacteria in our system without which we could not survive. That's an interesting engagement. That's different than biodiversity, whatever the hell that might mean. And I think we have to continuously come up with these new ways by listening to our audiences. And that's the quality of life, the brilliance of the quality of life approach, is that we listen to the audiences that are affected by our proposals and by our science.
I was very fascinated by your information, how your inspection initiatives led to protected areas. Can you tell us a bit more about the process from here to there, especially the institutional and organizational process that led to these successes? In the meantime, I would like to make just a communication suggestion. Some of us are using social media and tweets. Feel free and encouraged to do that during this meeting. But this was an aside.
Yes, the rapid inventories, the 30 rapid inventories that we have conducted have been at the invitation of some governmental entity in each of the regions, including the ones in North America. Usually to answer a question, if there is a proposed road through a region of the Amazonian rainforest, if there's proposed oil exploration, et cetera, what are the risks? What's at stake? What are the consequences? And we have been the entity of choice for answering that, again, because of the fact that we are a museum. We are not an NGO. We are not Greenpeace. We're not World Wildlife Foundation. We're not an academic institution. We don't represent government. We don't represent any industry. We're a museum. We are a neutral entity. And that role of being a neutral entity is extremely important to us. We collect the information, and at the end of that information, which is collected over 4 to 5 weeks, we compile it very quickly into a book, complete with photographs, etc. And then we bring all of the interested parties, the indigenous population, the governmental entities, and the extractive industries into a room and present our findings to them. And we will only do this in a collective manner. We will not do it to separate groups because we want to begin a conversation immediately. And I'm very pleased to tell you that the frequency with which extractive industries come to understand the cost, not only in terms of biodiversity, but also in public relations, et cetera, of building that road, of exploring for oil in this region, that cost is greater than the potential payoff in many cases. And this has been a key element in our success, is the ability to bring these people together into a room and confront our findings face to face and determine who is going to prevail, whose interests are going to prevail. And this is where giving voice to the indigenous population is so vital. It seems, I tend to be a little cynical personally, and it seems, when I first heard about this, it seemed unlikely that the oil industries and the timber industries, et cetera, would succumb to reason in this way. But they have done, and they continue to do, and largely I think it has to do with the simple confrontation with the cost to humanity of violating these areas of great biodiversity value.
I'm just wondering, does your group consider the long-range robustness of the areas that have been set aside? I mean, we're living in a world, as you well know, where 2.3 billion people are being added in the next 30 years at the rate of about 300,000 a day, and something like 11 billion people will be on the planet. And we live in a world where if everybody lived as we do in the United States, everything would be exhausted that was sustainable by August 1st, and we'd need 5 planets. If we lived in a world like Western Europe, everything would be exhausted by something like March 1st. I mean, at that level of consumption. So I've always been very concerned with whether we could find the goodness in our hearts to reach out to other people around the world, or whether the kind of selfishness that's so evident now will overcome this. A cartoon of it would be, we just passed a grant for some Australian person to get the people in Equatorial Guinea to stop eating gorillas and chimps. But they live on an average income of about $1,200 a year. We in Western Europe and the United States live on an average income of $50,000 or $60,000 a year. I hope that some of the time at the Field Museum, which is an institution that of course I respect extraordinarily deeply for its contribution, and you for your resourcefulness in reshaping these programs, I hope that you're finding a way to address some of these fundamental problems. I worry even about the longevity of the preserved areas in the United States, because if we bully everyone to keep on living at a standard of living 5 times theirs, how long will that go on, and what will happen, and how can we justify it from a social or moral point of view?
Well, Peter, you have put your finger right on the issue that causes us to lose the most sleep. We are very proud of the areas that we have protected. We continue to work very closely with the indigenous populations and protecting their interest in protecting them. The pressure is overwhelming. And we spend probably more time than we should advocating for things like RED, carbon exchanges, cap and trade legislation, et cetera. I'm very pessimistic about the near term. I don't see that the virtue and goodwill of well-intentioned people is going to prevail against the pressures that you just described.
Two more quick points, though, that are worthwhile. One is that if you look at the biodiversity of the world, the areas where you're working are the least known rich ones, along with Southeastern Asia to Southeastern tropical Asia, so you couldn't find a better place.
That's why we're there.
Yeah, and whatever the second point was, age has stolen it from me.
I'm very familiar with that phenomenon.
An interesting point from the IPBES report on the state of biodiversity is that areas where native populations are still active are richer and better protected than where these people have gone. So it really speaks to your point, and the question of how to empower such communities to exercise stewardship independent of what we in the West think is right or wrong.
Well, and I think the examples that Lori gave of engaging indigenous populations is also validating. We want to preserve the lives that we have, the good things around us. Peter's description of the overwhelming pressures are pretty grim, but in the meantime, we have to do what we can. And I think that's part of the moral imperative of these institutions.
It's worth quoting Dan Jansen, if you don't save it now, you can't save it later.
That's right.
And the other point I was going to make came back to me in a flash of understanding and reason. We have to think of things like China, which is using something like 1.3 times its internal capacity for sustainable development, spending huge sums of money all over the world and draining resources out of countries that are really at the point of what my colleagues and I have called an ecological poverty trap, where they have nothing left to sell. And that's just one example of why the poor countries of the world, where the biodiversity is concentrated, are going to have such a difficult row to hoe unless the kind of special morality for social justice that we require so badly comes into being.
Yes, we are fortunate at the Field Museum. We work very closely with Hank Paulson, the former Secretary of the Treasury, who has an institute at the University of Chicago focused on China. He is very interested in these questions, as are we, and we are very concerned about the impact of the Belt and Road Initiative, the so-called BRI. So we have banded together to focus on the areas of greatest biodiversity, the Amazonian region, to see that at least there, if that Belt and Road Initiative can have the least possible impact.
We just need to, just one final thing, we just need to remember that we and the countries of Western Europe are sucking huge amount of sustainable products out of those countries too, sucking huge amounts of sustainable production out of those countries too, and have been doing so for 200 years, since the Industrial Revolution gave us enough punch to be able to really reach out around the world. And the reason that we properly focus a lot on the Belt and Road Initiative is it's something that's visible and actively going on right now. However, pointing fingers is a very dangerous thing too, if you consider the history of the United States or the history of England or Germany or any other country. We don't live on our own resources either, not by a long shot, not by a much longer shot than China.
That's right.
Well, your point about the credibility of museums is very interesting. The fact that maybe the same science message coming from a museum is perceived differently than from a scientist. That's a very good point. Like to ask you to elaborate a little bit more on this and on how this could be better used. About the question that Peter Raven raised about the longevity of protected areas, I think that yes, there is room for concern about the future of protected areas, but that doesn't reduce the importance of creating protected areas. I think it's very important to create protected areas. When I was in office, we were able to create 12 million hectares of protected areas in Amazonas. And I think it's a step forward. And I share with you the frustration about international mechanisms such as REDD+, and their ability to deliver results, and GEF and the Global Climate Fund, the Green Climate Fund, and other mechanisms. But I think one thing that we may use this event here to move forward is on how we can share our experience and design new and innovative mechanisms of linking civil society to action. Because I think governments are generally very inefficient and very slow, and we need fast action. So the question is, how can we design new mechanisms to improve the management of protected areas throughout the world?
Well, if I had the answer to that, I wouldn't be sitting here, I'd be out doing it. But yes, we must create these protected areas, but preserving them over the long term against the pressures that Peter described earlier is very daunting. I remain committed and dedicated and not terribly optimistic in the long run.
Paul, just a second. So I think we can now open the floor for a general discussion as advertised in the program. But if you still want to address Richard, but you can also address the other speakers, but also feel free to chip in from the audience to help to solve some of the problems or puzzles we try to struggle here with. So it's now a general discussion as well as a specific one.
Okay, so I actually did want to bring up something general and introduce a note of optimism. And I'll do that via an anecdote from the UK. Some of you who are perhaps familiar with the politics there will remember back in 2010, the new government, when it came in, tried to sell off the public forest estate. Now, all governments want to save money. All governments like to sell things off if they can. It's not very large, the public forest estate in England. It's about 250,000 hectares. But it means a lot to the people who use it. And so there was outcry, and an inquiry was put up, led by the Bishop of Liverpool, James Jones. And one of the first things that they did was to get an accountancy company to come in and apply natural capital accounting to look at the value of that public forest estate. And of course, the timber value of the standing wood was way down on the list. It was about 6th. At the top came recreational value, then there was aesthetic value, because people pay more for their houses if they have a view. There was carbon, there was biodiversity, there was employment. These forests employ about 30,000 people. So the intrinsic value of that timber was a long way down the list. And that report, I think, really changed things in the UK, certainly, and this principle of natural capital accounting was adopted by central government. And up until now, they have stuck with that, and that is the policy of the Department of Environment, not just in forestry, but also in agriculture, to look at the whole. And, you know, we've heard earlier that we need to shift really our economic paradigm and how we measure inputs and outputs. And I think one of the great things that has come out of that also is a generation of economists who are developing methodologies for natural capital accounting. And if you can do that in well-organized, developed nations, and I will say as a caveat that the United Kingdom, we sometimes joke, I'm a botanist, that we have more botanists than we have plant species, so we are not particularly biologically diverse. We have more botanists than plant species in the United Kingdom, which is why we go and interfere with other people's botany. But the fact is, if this can be done in a mature democracy, and if we can make it work, then I think that there is potential for scaling that up and that being applied elsewhere, this fundamental principle of natural capital accounting, and we're getting better at that.
If you were living in an African country where the population was doubling in the next 30 years or more than doubling, and where the average income was $1,700 a year, say, and you were well motivated, what could you do?
Well, I think the same principles.
And fundamentally, will the UK, the US, and other rich countries decide that the preservation of biodiversity in those countries is so important, or that something that humanity is so important that they'll be willing to support them to get to a more lasting standard of living instead of ravaging their last resources? Because too much of conservation argument, in my view, is based on the fact that we have these great schemes to preserve things all over the world, but we don't have the humility and the justice and the willingness to put out our money to make them come true. And I think that's an enormous problem for the world, not only in this sense, but in the sense of global climate change, in the sense of avoiding war, in the sense of avoiding slavery, or almost any other issue you can think of.
I think these problems of watersheds and energy, health, water, and so on, the basics for life, are even more pertinent in developing countries. And in fact, we had a delegation come from Ethiopia just 2 weeks ago to meet with our Forestry Research Institute, and they came to BGCI. Ethiopia has committed to restore 22 million hectares of forest. 7 million hectares of that plantation, but the other 15 million are native species to restore catchments and so on. So this is being driven by developing country governments. I understand fully the value of natural capital accounting, because without trees there is no water. Without trees there is no fuel. But it's how you get that into central government thinking, and particularly ministries of finance, and how you build policy around that, I think, is absolutely critical.
The American poet Ogden Nash once said, there are lots of things in this world that money can't buy, but did you ever try to buy them without any? In other words, there can be great schemes for preservation in those countries, but if we don't back them up continuously and stop living on the fantasy that because Africa is growing rapidly and has a lot of young people, it'll all be wonderful there in the very short order on a finite planet, then I think we may be just shifting deck chairs on the Titanic. But let me repeat what I said before, quoting Dan Jansen, the very good American ecologist: if we don't save it now, we can't save it later. And that's why anything we do now is absolutely worth doing, but we must turn quickly to find ways to back it up in a world that's hurtling along at a frightening speed, and that often seems to believe that consumption can be indefinite for the rich. 8 people in the world, after all, own as much money as the 3.6 billion poorest people in the world. And you know, you say, well, they're doing good things, but are they doing good things we all want them to do? Are they doing good things that are beneficial for the world? And will we really reach stability following the paths that we are? But again, let me rest with, if you don't save it now, you can't save it later.
I'll just make one more comment, Peter, and that is that technically we can do this. But you're right, it is about how we get the resources into place. Those African governments, the African governments that have signed up to the Bond Challenge through the African Forest Landscape Restoration Initiative, have pledged to restore 113 million hectares of forests. Technically, we know how to do this. But getting the resources and the knowledge to the right places to do that in the time frame is where the challenge will be.
I think I want to raise a connected broader issue, or broad issue. I think we need to watch out that the fascination for nature is not mainly a fascination by rich people. And we must not lose sight that the largest environmental footprint is by the rich of this world and not by the poor. So numbers of population matter less than the consumption patterns of the global middle class. The great initiatives by the museums, which we have listened to this morning, on stimulating fascination with nature, I think could be complemented, and I would like to hear a reaction from our four speakers, by initiatives to track consequences of lifestyle, standard of living, consumption patterns. And in particular, that's my second question or comment, we had, at least from three of you, very interesting comments to touch on the climate change agenda. But may I ask you to push a bit further on how you, with your wonderful in-reach and outreach activities, address that issue? What's your strategy on that? Johannes, you had made a few very interesting comments on that, but we had here at the Academy 3 meetings on climate change, including large and powerful communities from California. Gordon Brown was here, but your community was not at these meetings, if I recall correctly. Now you are here. Now I ask you, how can you add to the climate change agenda, and what are you doing in that field?
Laurie, let me just answer first. So we've done a very interesting experiment that should give us great hope, albeit it again addresses the issue of the northerners with the footprint. That's just where we are situated as organizations. So we put up an exhibition where we invited an artist to give a bird's eye view on the state of the world. And these are pictures that remind you of abstract art, but they show the horror we unleash when you get closer. On the inside of these stands, you then have the best science available by the European Research Centre, the Joint Research Centre of the EU, which governs everything that we eat, the quality of the water, the straightness of cucumbers, all this type of stuff. So they provide best science policy advice. And then we did the interpretation and the programming around that. And it started off as an exhibition, very slow, and now, half a year in, 38% of our visitors come because of this exhibition. So it means you can translate very complicated scientific topics, you need new stakeholders, and you need time for these messages to go through by word of mouth. So I think we can do it, but probably not the way we've traditionally done it. That would be my plea.
So I think one of the challenges that we have in museums goes to the point that Richard made, that museums are trusted. They're more trusted by the U.S. public than scientists at universities. And that's an issue because with the politicization of the climate change argument, it becomes a problem for some of us to be appearing to be advocates as opposed to being neutral and objective. So what I have told my board is that board members who might be concerned about entering the public conversation around the politics, that we are advocates for science. And so what we need to do is make sure that our public understands the science of climate change. We have, in addition to the Natural History Museum, I oversee La Brea tar pits. I don't know how many of you know La Brea tar pits, but it is the largest collection of Ice Age fossils in the world. 50,000 years. We have the megafauna, the mammoths and mastodons and saber-toothed cats, but we also have pollen. We have small mammals, beetle wings preserved in the asphalt, and that is in the heart of Los Angeles, in a place where fossil fuels were extracted. So we don't touch this right now in the exhibits itself, other than through a film that we have that was done in the Field Museum, and we have it at the museum. But we're reimagining what that place could be in the heart of a city to tell the story about what we know from the last 50,000 years and the rate of change from natural climate change on the ecology of our community. And we can use that as the backdrop to talk about the past as a way to understand the present and the future and the rate of change argument that is so critical to this conversation. So I think it's been the case that museums in the US have had a bit of a fine line on these issues when it comes to speaking openly about the science because of the politicization of it.
Yeah.
Yes, it's difficult to convince people how to speak about science to people who are not aware at all of what is science. That's really a big concern. I participate to a board of people to write the new programs for young children, not so young, 16 years old, 17 years old, at the end of the high school. And we will have in France a new program regarding science, how to teach science to all children, whatever their orientation, going to philosophy, to natural science, to mathematics, and so on. So it's a common part of the program. And we have a big discussion about that. We were together, mathematicians, physicians, and, from people from chemistry, from natural science, from informatics, and so on, how to speak about science to those young people and to convince them. And the way we found finally was to try to explain the path by which science obtains some results. What's the path? Because today, people are just looking at this thing, at their phone, and they say, oh, but this is telling me this, and you are telling me some other things. But those two things are considered as priori as equal, but they are not. So if you explain the path by which you obtain scientific results, for example, the age of Earth, or something like that, you can try to grab the attention and try to make understandable that your results is not just something going outside your brain, right, like that, and that you follow this path. So that's really your first challenge. And of course, there is no single solution according you are dealing with for ordinary citizens, young people, politicians, people from big economic companies or to medias and so on. There are different solutions. And but we need, through different solutions, to restore the public trust in the scientific message. That's one very important challenge. The second challenge is probably when we are discussing about climate change and comparing biodiversity challenge with climate change. Climate change is relatively simple by comparison with biodiversity change. Because you have the temperature, you have the humidity, and everybody is able to understand that. Biodiversity, what is biodiversity? What is an assessment of the biodiversity state at the scale of the Earth? Nobody can answer. It's not serious to try to answer that. We cannot really answer, and the only answers that you can have is just like an impressionist painting, touch after touch. We have a small stand of pen, painter. I don't know if the English word is correct, but you probably see what I mean. You have small thing on the big bench of a big paint, and from the wide you have a nice picture. You can have a picture. That's the same with biodiversity. We need to have information from every kind of environment, every place on the planet, and from that we can build a general picture. But it's much more difficult than for the climate. And it's difficult to explain, but we have a very nice agenda. We've just had the IPBES meeting in Paris a few days ago. I participate to that, and I see how the media were interested by that, and how the politicians also were interested. We will have IUCN big international meeting next year, and we will also have the COP, the COP 15 in China next year. So we have a very good agenda for biodiversity, and we have to raise the things. And I have seen a very nice paper, scientific paper, comparing climate change and biodiversity in Canada, in the media, how the media took those two messages. And you see the gap. You physically see the gap between the two dimensions, the two aspects. And it's interesting to see how biodiversity can compensate is delay by comparison with the climate change. This is another challenge that we have in front of us, but we have those three big meetings, IPBES, IUCN, and COP15, that are in front of us, and we need to use them to promote biodiversity approaches.
We may even think about the communities convened here trying to do that together.
I would like to bring your focus a little bit to another community, what we forgot, and what I think what we as Zeus did not early enough. When we're talking about politicians, we often mean not only the acting politicians, but also the administrators. And this is something what has to be really in mind. Let's say for our community, the EU legislation is one of the most important. But at the last EU elections, 70%, 70% of the parliamentarians were exchanged. So when you have bonds to the politicians, and you have them only for 5 years, you forget all these ones which are in place and run this organization. So this is something what we should all have in mind. This is just a reminder from me.
I want to ask to the Professor Rivière about the Belt and Road, the China project of Belt and Road, and in what sense it's not sustainable of the developed sustainable, or is in this line, or of course it's a concern about Africa, but also India. You have some contact with this project, because the major part of the population today is in this part of the world. So we need to know exactly what is the situation, if we can.
Well, specifically with regard to the Chinese initiatives, the Belt and Road Initiative is a pervasive project of the Chinese government. It's not in the hands of a single ministry or so tightly focused. So what we have attempted to do is to basically to praise the Chinese government for their concern about the preservation of the environment. Now, to some extent, this is a little bit, well, some theater on our part, because they have not shown a great deal of concern in the past, but they are very sensitive about this from a perception. They don't want people in this room to say the Chinese are as bad as the Americans in terms of consuming things. So we are using that as we are putting our arms around them and praising them and saying, now let us help you work in the Andes Amazon region to preserve, build the road, but don't build it here. Build the port, but don't build it there. We're in very early days with this, and I don't want to give the impression that we have some remarkable influence on the Chinese government. We don't. But we are trying very hard to talk to people who do have influence on the Chinese government, and to basically help preserve the image of the Chinese as concerned about green issues. It's a tough road to hoe, but that's, I think, a much better approach than saying you cannot build the road here, because at the end of the day, if the political forces succumb to the Chinese interests, they'll build the road there. So we want to be on their side and help them choose where to build their resources.
I may comment a little bit, being in touch with China quite a bit. It is fascinating to see how China currently tries to change its energy sector towards electricity-based mobility, and it very much will depend how the investments in global infrastructure will reduce or increase environmental burdens. Current global trade is based on a lot of dirty energy and inefficiencies, so the efficiency gains, say, of connecting Asia with Western Europe based on electricity-powered trains would be a huge benefit compared to the dirty shipping routes. I think we need to bring together infrastructure planners, city planners, and environmentalists. My sense is that China is open to that. The Chinese middle class, as any middle class in the world, loves nature. The movement in China on biosensitive cities, I was at conferences on that, I think is ahead of many of those movements of us, at least in Germany, probably also in the US. So we need to get together. I think the world needs different infrastructure that is environmentally sensitively built and run. But we also need to include the Chinese citizens in the adjustment to consumption habits and consumption, which through the soy imports, etc., leads to cutting rainforests worldwide. So it's a complex topic which we need to debate, but the fact remains we in the West have pumped the CO2 first into and have exhausted the capacity of the atmosphere, and then came China and India. Thank you.
I now have four contributions, and perhaps we start with with Mr. Volt, then go to Mr. Weisinger, Mr. Viana, and then Mr. Desoleng-Boucher.
Well, thank you very much. I'm here as a theologian, also contributing to the debates in Denmark from time to time. I very much understand the emphasis of neutrality for the museums, because you are, as you said, Richard, you're having a great authority. The problem could be interesting to discuss whether you lose authority if you are no longer neutral. Because if we are to change a mentality that has developed into an insane mentality, and I think we have, the first thing we could lose is hope. And if you lose hope in a culture that is influenced by nihilism, expressed in a relativistic view of many things, we are doomed. So the museums are, as one of you said, it's cabinets of curiosity, it's also cabinets of history and heritage. And I think every time you look at history, when we need to change the culture, we look back. We become conscious of our heritage. At least that's what renews theology. When theology gets stuck, it goes back to the tradition and it finds vividness in the tradition in order to renew itself. So would it be possible to host discussions or principal themes? I read once in an essay by Einstein, he said, we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we had when we created them. And we need a change of thinking. Some of my colleagues at the university, they suffer from the culture of measuring everything. Our good friend here who died, he was a close friend to me, Hans Sacher, he said once that we have a culture of measuring or a rating society. So if we are to oppose a rating society where we think that we can measure the essential things, I think the museums and the botanical gardens and the zoos are an excellent opportunity, because you have this authority, an excellent opportunity to host this, leaving neutrality, but not leaving the authority that you have as a museum and an institution, highly respected.
Okay. Following Professor Brown's remark in the beginning about the rich and poor populations, and after your remark now, I want to share one thought of myself, one thought I think all this morning. Many rabbis, and I'm a Jewish rabbi, and also a lot of religious Jews today, are recalling all the deal with this issue. So a lot of the general thought between the Jewish community now in Israel, that all this deal is part of the secular or not religious people in Israel. Also, this field is also, this field in the museums do not rise like the other fields in Israel. The Green Party, political party, can't come into the Knesset, into the government. The main reason we'll talk about tomorrow, but the main reason I'm thinking this morning is because throughout the years, thousands of years, the rabbis what we did all through all the years was preserving the religion, then preserving the nature. That's a big mistake. This is something we're doing now in education in Israel and abroad. But the reason I'm here, the real reason I'm here, it's not easy. When you come out to talk with people, talk to children, talk to students, they don't really understand what we're doing. Why are we doing it? And I would want to hear, to listen, to find out from your experience. If you have small populations, small Jewish or religious populations, what do you do and how do you share all this data you gave us this morning to change the thoughts, like we said now, to the population in Israel? Thank you.
Well, just like to get back to the issue about China that was raised. I have a slightly different perspective than was mentioned here. I had a chance of visiting China for the second time about 2 years ago, invited by the Chinese Academy of Sciences, which had a very good meeting on ecosystem services. And I was extremely impressed with the political discourse. Mr. Qing says, or calls for a green revolution. And he speaks about green mountains and clean rivers being gold and silver. And it's amazing that this comes from the top and trickles down all the way to the low rankings because of the political system that they have. So there's coherence in the political discourse. And that's driven by, I think, an issue of climate and health. Mostly air pollution, which is the biggest driver of those policies. But I think it's very serious. And they also have the largest program of investment in solar energy, and also the largest program in the world in terms of restoration of forests, planting trees. So it's very positive domestically. The issue is that when we bring to One Belt, One Road initiative, which is the international outreach of China. And then there is, I think, a challenge of political coherence, because the same rationale doesn't apply equally. But I think it's an opportunity there. I think we should build on the discourse that, relatively speaking, today in the world, I think Mr. Xi has probably the closest discourse to Pope Francis about green revolution, paradoxically. I think the discourse of China is very close to Laudato Si. I think we should just push for coherence in the international approaches that they currently have.
First of all, let me take this opportunity to thank the presenters. I think there is a lot to learn as emerging and developing countries in Africa can learn from the neutrality which has been mentioned of the museums. And maybe it would be a time to support the local initiatives in developing countries where you find lots of opportunities to serve the global community as responsible global citizens. Having said this, my view on the Belt and Road Initiative is similar to what the minister was saying from Brazil, simply because it is the responsibility of each and individual countries how they are going to use this initiative to their own conditions. To us in Africa, for example, we need infrastructure because there is huge infrastructure deficit. But on the other hand, how can we utilize this opportunity to the benefit of our own people and to the environment as responsible citizens? One good example is we have been able to build a railway infrastructure connecting Ethiopia to Djibouti with this Belt and Road Initiative. But it's we who designed it. It's we who has taken care of our environment. And we designed in such a way that this railway should be, using energy from renewable sources, where we have enough of them in Africa. And we asked the Chinese to build our own energy sources before doing this, to have an electrical driven from renewable sources of energy, and we succeeded in doing so. And all the designs has taken care of our environment properly, even though any construction has its own impact. we have made an impact analysis very carefully by our own. So it's not the Chinese who should be on the driving seat. It should be we who should be on the driving seat. I think it's the way how we approach this issue is very important. Second, the Chinese do not want to be seen like bullying like the United States leadership at this time. They want to be seen as a global leaders in environmental management. And so I think this is where they are. They have a number of initiatives to work on the climate change issue and green growth and green economy. And I think maybe they will be the leaders in the near future on this issue, while, as my friend said, they are very conscious and cognizant of the fact that they don't want to be beaten by by the global diplomacy at this moment. And they should understand also that this fact helps us to benefit from what they are doing, both domestically and internationally. Thank you.
Just to add to the discussion about the Chinese government, they will, as I think somebody has said, be hosting the COP in autumn next year in Kunming, so in Yunnan. I was in Yunnan in January, and we got a sneak preview of the Chinese government's position on this from the Chinese Academy of Sciences. They want Kunming 2020 to be the equivalent of the Paris Accord. And I think now is a unique opportunity over the next year and a half to work with the Chinese to set an example. And actually, one of the things that they are promoting is this idea of eco-civilization. And if you Google it, you will see it associated with Chinese authors and so on. And again, this has come from the top. And particularly with increasing urbanization in China and across the world, the idea is of zoning, catchment forests, and so on. And this is very much part of Chinese Academy of Sciences policy making and thinking at this time. So we're about to enter a critical year and a half, I think, leading up to that. But I mean, Sergey, you know China very well. Yeah.
As a person who was working in China for 5 years for Chinese Academy of Sciences, and especially the Kunming Institute of Botany was mentioned, this is a place where I was working. I had an opportunity to learn what actually in China has been done for conservation. And I would like to agree with Richard that there is more impressions than real work, despite the fact that huge money were poured into this area. But unfortunately, implementation is not what we would like to see. The intentions maybe are good, but implementations are not. And for example, huge areas were planted with trees, but most of these trees are not native Chinese trees. And the last remaining areas with native vegetation are still exploited for timber. And I will give you another example. I was working in Kunming Institute of Botany, and in this place there is the largest seed bank in the East Asia, and with a huge collection, and with a lot of money, a huge building, and the collection of about 20,000 species. But when I asked a curator how many threatened species they have in their collection, she said 74. And when I checked the list, actually it was less than 50. So it's more impression than real deeds when we are talking about how China is implementing conservation. And so I would like you not to be misled by what is going on there. Thank you.
I just want to say, and let's keep thinking about this, what China's doing in the Belt and Road Initiative is quite destructive in many places. And if you read the accounts for every country and see what's already gone on, you will understand that. China is playing the same game that Britain played in the first half of the 19th century, but in a world of 7.7 billion people instead of a world of 1 billion people. But the essential point, and that's the one that I would like us never to forget, is that the United States and the countries of Western Europe are draining a huge amount more from the world than China has ever thought of yet. And if we don't find ways to share our wealth and to stop draining so much from other countries that we can live on such incredibly high standards of living, which on a global basis are insupportable, and if we allow ourselves to be distracted by China or distracted by anything and forget our role in the world, we'll never get to a sustainable world.
Thank you, Peter. That was a very fitting closing to this morning's session. I thank everybody for their contributions, especially and first and foremost, Laurie, Richard, and Bruno. So thank you very much for that. But I'm also incredibly pleased about the broad and thoughtful contributions everybody made. So thank you very much indeed. And I think we now have deserved some lunch, but I'm not so up on the arrangement, so perhaps somebody else can tell us what to do next. But thank you very much, and we see you at 1400 again in this room when Thomas is going to take over and the world is turning to zoos. Thank you.